She held up the dress I'd spent 6 weeks making and said, "Oh, Mom, you actually sewed this yourself?" Then she laughed, not a mean laugh, just the kind that doesn't bother to hide anything, and handed it to her husband. "Craig, look, she made it." He smiled the way people smile at children's drawings. "That's sweet, Dorothy. Next time, though, just get her a gift card. Save yourself the trouble." My daughter said nothing. She folded the dress carefully, the way you fold something you plan to throw away later, and set it on the edge of the table. I smiled. I picked up my handbag, and I walked to the car before anyone noticed my hands were shaking. I sat in the driveway for a long time. The engine was running, but I wasn't ready to move. The evening light had gone amber, the kind that makes everything look warmer than it is. Inside, through the living room window, I could see them. Sandra laughing at something, Craig said. My granddaughter Emma on her phone. Nobody looked for me. Nobody came to the door. I had chosen the fabric 3 months ago. Deep plum, the kind Sandra always reached for when we used to shop together before Craig, before the house in Scottsdale, before she started referring to me as my mother to her friends instead of Mom. I'd found the bolt at the little fabric shop on Birchwood Street, the one that smells like cedar and lavender and something older, something that reminds me of my own mother's sewing room. I'd carried it home and washed it twice and cut the pattern by hand. I hadn't used a pattern in 20 years, but I remembered the shape of Sandra's shoulders, the way she always tugged at the waist of store-bought dresses, the exact curve she never loved about herself that I'd been quietly accounting for since she was 16. 6 weeks. Every evening after dinner, I sat under the good lamp and worked. Robert used to tease me about that lamp, said it was bright enough to land planes. He wasn't wrong, but I needed to see what I was doing. I needed to get it right. I did get it right. I knew it when I held it up the morning I finished the hem. It was beautiful. Not in a showy way, but in the way that handmade things are beautiful, because you can feel the hours in them if you pay attention. Sandra didn't pay attention. I backed out of the driveway slowly and drove home through the quiet streets. The radio was off. I didn't want music. I just wanted silence and the sound of my own thinking, which had gotten clearer over the past few hours, in a way I wasn't quite prepared for. At home, I made tea I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table. The house was clean. I'd cleaned it that morning the way I always did before driving over to their place, out of some old habit of wanting to come home to order. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove ticked. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. I opened the drawer beside the stove. In the back, behind the takeout menus and the expired coupons, was a small green notebook. I'd started it 2 years ago when my accountant, a careful man named Gerald who always smelled like peppermint, gently suggested I start tracking my personal finances more closely. I hadn't looked at it in months. I brought it to the table and opened it to the last written page. The entries were in my handwriting, small and precise, the way Robert always said I wrote, like I was afraid of wasting space. The first entry was from 2019, $3,200 for the down payment assistance they needed when they were short. Then, $1,400 for the car repair, the one Craig said came out of nowhere. Then the quarterly deposits into Emma's college fund, which I'd set up automatically because Sandra had mentioned once, casually, at a Sunday dinner, that they weren't sure how they'd manage it. I hadn't been asked. I had just listened and then acted, the way I always did. I kept turning pages. There were the holiday checks, the emergency transfer when Craig's business had a slow quarter, Sandra's dental work the year her insurance didn't cover the procedure she needed, the security deposit for their first apartment, the flight home when Emma broke her arm at summer camp and Sandra called me in a panic and I bought the ticket without thinking, because that's what you do. I added the column at the bottom with a pencil, the way Robert taught me, slow and careful. Then I checked it twice. $94,620, over 9 years. I set the pencil down. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I had expected anger, had been braced for it the way you brace, for a wave you can see coming. But what I felt instead was something quieter and, in a way, worse. I felt foolish, not forgiving. I had wanted to give, but for believing, all those years, that giving was the same as being known. I closed the notebook, carried it back to the drawer, and then kept walking down the hall to the spare room where I kept my fabric and my thread, and the old sewing cabinet Robert built me for our 25th anniversary. He'd made it himself, which I hadn't known until he gave it. He was not a craftsman. The joints were uneven, and one of the doors didn't close quite right. It was the most beautiful piece of furniture I owned. I sat on the chair beside it and put my hand on the wood. He would have known what to say. He always did, even when I thought he wasn't listening, especially then. I went to bed that night without deciding anything, but I woke up the next morning knowing the bank opened at 9. I was in the parking lot by 8:50, watching the staff arrive, watching the lights come on inside. There was something clarifying about it, sitting there in the early quiet, the kind of clarifying that comes not from a decision, but from the end of a long indecision. Inside, a young man named Marcus helped me. He had kind eyes and didn't rush me, and didn't flinch when I told him what I wanted. I needed to stop the automatic transfers, all of them. The deposits into Emma's college fund, the quarterly check that went to Sandra's household account, the standing arrangement I'd set up with their mortgage servicer 3 years ago when they'd had a rough patch that never quite seemed to end. Marcus typed quietly, confirmed each one, asked me to sign where he indicated. I signed without hesitating. Then I asked about the account authorization. Sandra had been listed as secondary account holder for nearly 8 years, something I'd set up after Robert passed, when I was still in that raw early grief, where everything seemed like preparation for dying. I wasn't dying. I was 62 years old, and I wanted my accounts back. Marcus said he'd prepare the paperwork. I said I'd wait. It took 40 minutes. I sat in the small chair by his desk and looked out the window at the parking lot. A woman was helping an elderly man out of a car, holding his elbow gently, taking her time. I watched until they disappeared through the door. When I left, the morning felt different. Not lighter exactly, more solid, like the ground had come up an inch or two to meet me. I called Judith from the car. We'd been friends since 1984, when we taught at the same elementary school on Maple Ridge and discovered we both hated the new copy machine and loved the same brand of terrible vending machine coffee. She was retired now, too. She answered on the second ring like she always did, as if she'd been waiting. "You sound strange," she said. "I had a night," I said. "Tell me." I told her about the dress, about Craig's voice, about Sandra's careful folding, about the green notebook. There was a pause. Then Judith said, "I've been waiting 12 years for you to do something about that family. You never said anything. You wouldn't have heard me 12 years ago." She was right. I wouldn't have. I would have explained it away, the way you explain away small humiliations when you're still invested in a particular story about the people you love. The story where they see you. The story where they'll come around. I drove home, made real breakfast for the first time in a while. Eggs and toast and actual coffee, not the decaf I'd been drinking since my doctor mentioned blood pressure. I sat at the table and ate slowly, and didn't think about whether anyone needed anything. The dress was still on my mind. Not with sadness, more like a question. I had made it for Sandra, but Sandra hadn't wanted it, and the dress was still beautiful. That hadn't changed. In the afternoon, I went to the community board at the library. There was a notice for a clothing exchange happening the following Saturday. I took down the number, called, and asked if handmade items were welcome. The woman on the phone said, "Honey, handmade items are the best items." I told her I'd bring a dress. That evening, my phone rang. It was Sandra. I watched the name on the screen for a moment, then set the phone face down on the counter. She called again an hour later. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. Her voice had that careful quality it got, when she was trying not to sound upset and failing. She said there seemed to be a problem with one of her accounts, and could I please call when I had a chance. No mention of the dress, no mention of the party, no thank you for the 6 weeks. I didn't call back that night. I made dinner instead, a real one, chicken and roasted vegetables and the good bread from the bakery on 5th, the kind I usually only bought when someone was coming over. Nobody was coming over, but I bought it for myself, and I ate it at my own table by the window and watched the light change outside until it was fully dark. The next morning I called my attorney. His name was Paul, and he'd been Robert's attorney first, then mine by inheritance, which seemed like the right word for most of what I'd carried since Robert died. He said he could see me Thursday. I said I needed sooner. He said Wednesday at 4. I said fine. Between now and then, I had work to do. I went to the spare room and opened the bottom of the sewing cabinet. Robert hadn't known I kept documents in there. Or maybe he had and simply trusted me, which was another way of saying the same thing. Inside was a folder I'd been adding to for years. Warranties, insurance information, the deed to the house, and in the back, a sealed envelope I hadn't opened since the week after the funeral. Robert's handwriting on the outside. Just my name, Dorothy. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table. I made tea first. Real tea, the kind you have to steep properly. I didn't rush it. Then I sat down and opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded in thirds, the way he always folded things, perfectly even. His handwriting was larger than mine, looser, like he trusted the space. Dorothy, it said, I hope you're reading this because you finally got fed up and not because anything is wrong. If something is wrong, call Paul. He knows what to do. If you're just fed up, good. You should have been fed up a long time ago. You give too much to people who take it for granted and not enough to yourself. I'm not naming names. You know the names. Do what you should have done years ago, and then go buy yourself something beautiful for once, not for somebody else. Something you'll actually use. I love you, Robert. I sat with that letter for a long time. The tea went cold. The light shifted across the table. I read it again. Then I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I laughed, not the polite kind, the real kind, from somewhere low and genuine, the kind that takes you by surprise, because it was so completely Robert. Even in a letter he'd written years ago for a moment he'd apparently seen coming, he still couldn't resist the practical note at the end. Call Paul. He knows what to do. I wiped my eyes and folded the letter back into thirds and placed it in the cedar box in my bedroom, beside the watch he wore every day for 30 years, and the photograph from our first trip to the Oregon coast. When we were both so young, it barely looked like us. Wednesday came. Paul's office was the same as it had always been, which was comforting, dark wood and bookshelves and the particular stillness of a room where serious things happen calmly. He didn't comment on the fact that I hadn't been in nearly 3 years. He just opened the folder with my previous documents and waited. I told him what I wanted. The will needed to change. Sandra would remain in it, but not as primary beneficiary. My grandson Eli would receive the house if he wanted it, and a separate fund for education and housing. The remainder of my estate would be divided between the library endowment I'd quietly supported for years and a women's shelter on the east side of the city where my friend Constance volunteered. Paul wrote without expression. When I finished, he looked up and said, "Is there anything you'd like to leave for Sandra?" I thought for a moment. "The sewing cabinet," I said. "Robert built it. She should have something of his." He noted it. Then he asked if I wanted to remove Sandra's name from any other legal documents. I handed him the list I'd made that morning. He nodded and said he'd prepare everything by the end of the week. Outside, the afternoon was bright and cool. I walked to the bakery 2 blocks from Paul's office and sat at a table by the window with a cup of coffee and a piece of lemon cake I hadn't planned to order and didn't regret. I ate it slowly. I watched the street. Nobody needed anything from me. My phone buzzed. A text from Eli. Just checking on you, Grandma. Can I come by this week? I typed back, come Sunday. I'll make the pot roast. He replied in seconds. He was 20, studying engineering at the state school, working part-time at a hardware store that reminded me of the one Robert's family had owned. He had Robert's eyes and his habit of noticing things other people missed. He'd come to visit at least twice a month since Robert passed, not because anyone told him to, but because he showed up the way certain people do, quietly, without needing a reason. He was the only one who'd asked me, the Christmas before last, how I was doing. Not how are you, the greeting you say walking past someone, but Grandma, how are you actually doing? And then sat on the couch for 2 hours while I told him. I paid for the coffee and the cake and walked to my car feeling, for the first time in a while, like I had done something right. Sandra came on Friday. She didn't call first. I was in the garden when I heard her car in the driveway, and I stayed where I was, kneeling in the dirt with my gloves on, turning the soil around the base of the rose bushes that had been fighting back all spring. She came through the side gate, which she had a habit of doing as if the house were still hers to enter freely. She'd grown up here. I understood the habit. I just didn't want to indulge it anymore. Mom. Her voice was careful. Sandra. I didn't stand up. I kept working. She stopped at the edge of the garden. Craig wasn't with her, which told me this was the version of the conversation she wanted controlled. She was dressed well, hair done, the kind of composed presentation you put on when you're about to have a difficult conversation and you want to feel armored. Something happened with my accounts, she said. I know. I pulled a weed from near the fence. I canceled the transfers. A beat of silence. All of them? All of them. She exhaled. Mom, that's you could have said something. You could have warned us. I looked up at her. I've been warning you for years, Sandra. You just weren't listening for it. She crossed her arms. The armor showed a crack. This is about the dress. The dress was the last thing, I said. It's not the whole thing. It was a joke. Craig was just being... I know what Craig was being. I stood up, slowly, and pulled off one glove. He was being the same thing he's been for 9 years. Dismissive. And you let him, which is your right. But I sat in my car that night, and I did some math, Sandra. Do you want to know what I found? She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. $94,000, I said, since you married him, not including the informal things, not including the time, the driving, the babysitting, the dinners I cooked and brought over when you had Emma, and you were exhausted. Just the money, just the amounts I could put a number on. Her face changed. Something moved behind her eyes that I recognized. Not guilt exactly, but the first awareness of something she'd been careful not to look at. I didn't ask you to, she started. You didn't have to. That was the whole arrangement, wasn't it? I never needed to be asked because I was always watching, always filling in the gaps before anyone had to feel uncomfortable, and that worked out very well for everyone except me. Her jaw tightened. So this is punishment? No, I said. This is me stopping. I pulled off the other glove. Those are different things, and I need you to understand the difference, because one of them means I'm bitter, and one of them means I just finally woke up. She looked at the garden, at the rose bushes, at some middle distance that held everything she wasn't ready to say. Then, what about Emma's college fund? And there it was, the real question. I had expected it. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would, which told me something about how far I'd already come. Emma's fund is separate, I said. It's set up for her directly. She'll receive it when she's ready for school. That hasn't changed. What changed is the rest. Sandra looked up. Something in her expression shifted, recalibrated. She'd expected a fight. She hadn't expected precision. Craig thinks you're having some kind of episode, she said. The word was intended to sting. I'm sure he does. I picked up my gardening basket. Tell him I said hello. She left the way she came, through the side gate, without another word. I heard her car start and pull away, and I stood very still for a moment, with my hand resting on the fence post. The sun was behind a cloud. A bird called from the sycamore in the back corner. I went inside and washed my hands and stood at the kitchen window looking out at nothing in particular. My chest felt calm, not hollow, not numb, not the performed calm of someone keeping something down. Just calm, the settled kind, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. Eli came Sunday as planned. He arrived with a bag from the good deli on University Avenue, turkey and Swiss on sourdough, because he knew I liked it, and he always paid attention to the kinds of small things other people filed away as unimportant. He was taller than the last time I'd seen him, which didn't seem possible but was. He hugged me at the door the way he always did, like hugging was a thing worth doing properly. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about his courses and the girl in his study group who made him nervous in a way that made him smile when he mentioned her, and a paper he was writing about structural load distribution that he managed to make genuinely interesting by the way he explained it. I told him about the garden, about the rose bushes. He asked good questions, the way Robert used to. After we ate, he helped me clear the plates and then sat back down across from me with that careful look he got when he was about to say something he'd been holding. "Mom told me," he said, "about the accounts, about you making changes. I expected she would. She's upset." He said it plainly, without taking a side. "I know. I'm not upset," he said. "I think you did the right thing." He folded his hands on the table. "I've watched them the way they talk about you sometimes. Like you're a resource. Like the question of what you need is a different kind of question than the question of what they need." He paused. "Robert would have said something years ago." "Robert said something in a letter," I said. "I just found it." Eli's face opened. "What did it say?" I told him. He laughed the same way I had, surprised and genuine, and for a moment I could see Robert so clearly in him that I had to look at the table. "I want you to know something," Eli said, when the laughter had settled. "Whatever you do with the house, with the money, any of it, I don't need anything from you. I never came here for that." "I know that," I said, "but I want you to have something. Not because of what you haven't asked for, because of who you are." He nodded slowly. He understood the difference, which was why I could tell him it all. We had the pot roast and talked until the light went low and golden through the kitchen window. When he left, he held my hand for a moment on the porch and said, "I'll call you Thursday, not a question. A promise." I stood at the door until his car turned the corner, then went inside and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in Robert's old mug, the blue one with the chipped handle that I kept washing and putting back in the cabinet because I couldn't bring myself to throw away a thing that his hands had touched so many times. The letter from Sandra arrived 4 days later. I recognized her handwriting on the envelope, the round, careful letters she'd had since middle school. I set it on the table and made tea before I opened it. She wrote that she didn't understand what had changed, that she felt blindsided, that the way I'd handled things felt designed to hurt rather than communicate. She wrote that she'd always believed I gave because I wanted to, and if that wasn't true, she wished I'd said so. She didn't apologize for the dress. She wrote that she hoped I'd be willing to talk, that she wanted to understand this new version of me, and that she hoped I wasn't pushing people away out of pride. I read it twice. Then I sat for a while with the window open and the spring air coming through and thought about what was true and what I wanted to say and whether I owed the full explanation to someone who still didn't know they needed to. "Apologize," I wrote back that same afternoon. I didn't rush it. I got out the good paper, the kind with the weight that tells you the words matter, and I wrote slowly. "Sandra, I gave because I wanted to. That part is true. But wanting to give and being taken for granted are not mutually exclusive, and I spent too many years believing that as long as my reasons were good, it didn't matter how the giving was received. It does matter. What you receive and how says something about what you believe you're worth. I am your mother, and I love you. I am also a woman who spent 6 weeks making you something beautiful, and I watched you fold it and set it aside in under 30 seconds. That is not a small thing. It is not a small thing to me. I am not punishing you. I am not having an episode. I am 62 years old, and I am choosing, for possibly the first time in my adult life, to put myself in the column marked important. I hope when the surprise wears off, you'll be able to understand that. I hope someday you'll want to. Mom. I sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox before I could add anything or take anything away. Then I stood on the porch for a moment in the afternoon light, hand resting on the post, listening to the neighborhood sounds, a lawnmower somewhere, children down the block, the distant hum of a passing plane. I went back inside. I put on music, the old jazz station Robert used to play on Sunday mornings, and I went to the sewing cabinet. There was a length of fabric I'd bought on impulse 6 months ago and never touched. Deep teal, the color of deep water, soft as anything. I hadn't known what I wanted to make with it. I knew now. I spread it across the cutting table and stood looking at it for a moment, measuring in the way that's less about numbers and more about knowing. I picked up the scissors. The fabric gave under them cleanly, the way good fabric does when it's meant for something. I wasn't making it for Sandra. I wasn't making it for a gift, or an occasion, or anyone's approval. I was making it for me, a dress with deep pockets and no apologies, in a color I had always loved and never worn, because I was always choosing for someone else. The light was good. The work was steady. The house was quiet in the right way. In the weeks that followed, I moved differently. Slower in some ways, more deliberate. I started going to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, something I'd talked about doing for years and never prioritized. I bought things I liked, the expensive honey, the heirloom tomatoes, a bunch of zinnias just for the table. I baked when I felt like it and didn't when I didn't. I called Judith twice a week, and we talked about everything and nothing, and laughed more than I'd remembered laughing in years. I stopped rehearsing conversations with Sandra in my head. I stopped imagining the one where she'd call and finally understand, finally see what I'd been quietly absorbing, finally say the things that would make the ledger feel balanced. That conversation might come. It might not. But I was no longer waiting for it to happen before I allowed myself to feel whole. Paul sent the finalized documents on a Tuesday. I signed them at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the window open, and no ceremony. It took 10 minutes. When I closed the folder, I felt the particular satisfaction of something completed. Not ended, completed. The way you feel when a long piece of work is finally finished, and you can stand back and see it for what it is. Eli called Thursday, as promised. We talked for 40 minutes. He'd sent in his summer program application. The girl from his study group had asked him to dinner. He laughed when he told me. Still nervous, still smiling. Before we hung up, he said, "You sound good, Grandma." "I am good," I said, "and I meant it the way you mean things when you're not performing them." The dress took me 3 weeks. When I finished the hem and held it up under the good lamp, I stood still for a moment. It was everything I'd imagined it to be. Deep teal, perfectly fitted, pockets on both sides, not made for anyone's approval, not given to anyone at all. I put it on, walked to the mirror in the hallway, stood there the way you stand, when you're not checking for flaws but just looking. I didn't see someone surviving. I didn't see someone waiting. I saw someone who made beautiful things with her own hands and had finally, after a very long time, decided to keep one. If any part of this is yours, if you've ever folded away something that hurt too much to look at directly, if you've ever stood in a parking lot after someone you loved dismissed your best effort and wondered when you started making yourself so small, I want you to know, it is not too late. Not if you're still standing, not if your hands still work, not if somewhere in you there's still a voice that knows the difference between being loved and being used. Listen to that voice. It's been waiting a long time for you to be quiet enough to hear it. You're allowed to stop. You're allowed to begin again. on your own terms, in your own time, for no one but yourself.